After I moved into my dream home, the neighbors blasted baby cries and sirens all night over my porch light, then mocked me saying, "This neighborhood eats newbies." After $2.3K in stress hospital bills, I got even in a way they'd never sleep again. I remember staring at the ceiling for the 100th night, counting the seams in the drywall like they were raindrops, like counting would make them stop. At 3:14 a.m., the first speaker down the line started, a thin, baby wail that ratcheted into a keening. Then the other speaker picked it up and layered a low, distant siren over it like a warped lullaby. My heart slammed into my ribs. My chest felt like it was being hammered from the inside. I sat up, raw and dizzy, and the porch light I'd left on to feel less alone stung the curtains with its yellow halo. I had left that light on because my home, my stupid, imperfect, perfect house in Portland, felt like the only thing that belonged to me after everything else fell apart. That light was mine. That house was mine. 3 months ago, I moved here with my savings, and a box of books, and a stubborn idea that I could finally sleep in peace. The neighborhood looked like the inside of a postcard. Tree-lined street, porches with hanging plants, an old couple who waved like they were in a Hallmark commercial. Across the drive, the couple next door, Daniel and Mara, moved in the same week. They had the kind of smile meant for cameras and a dog named Bruno that barked only when the mailman came. We exchanged the polite, neighborly things people say. "Welcome, if you need anything. We love our block." I believed it. The first night the crying started, I assumed it was a party downstairs or a newborn in someone's home, and that it would stop. It didn't. It became a pattern. A siren clip at 1 o'clock a.m., baby cries at 2:30, sometimes a police scanner sound. At first I opened my window and called the non-emergency line. They shrugged, no evidence of actual emergency, no calls from others. I asked for the name of whoever lived at the house that had the garage light on. They couldn't tell me. "Noise complaints have to be resolved by the residents," the dispatcher said, like it was my personal failing. When I finally walked over, pajamas, hair a mess, eyes bloodshot, Mara answered like I was supposed to knock with a smile. She said, "Your porch light is bright." She tilted her head, and there was this flash of amusement in her eyes. Her husband stood behind her with his arms crossed, and Bruno looked at me like I was a new chew toy. "It's disturbing our baby," she added, like a punchline. There was no baby. I told her that. She laughed, a high, awful sound that set my teeth on edge. "This neighborhood eats newbies for breakfast," she said, as though she had just taught me how things worked here. I tried to be reasonable. I left another complaint with the city. I bought blackout curtains. I tried white noise. None of it mattered. My doctor wrote me off as anxious the first time, then the second. The third time my hands shook so badly I couldn't fill out a form, and she ordered an EKG and blood work. "Stress cardiomyopathy," she said, cheap and clinical. A heart slammed by fear and sleeplessness. The ambulance trip, the tests, the sleepless nights in the ER lobby when they'd wheel me out and the lights would feel like neon knives. $2,300 later, and a stack of bills I couldn't stomach. Every bill had the name of the couple next door written invisibly across it. There was the night I went to their porch and banged until my knuckles ached. Mara opened the door in slippers, hair scraped into a messy bun, and just held up a hand like I was the problem bug in their house. "We warned you, neighbor," she said, and when I told her about the hospital bills she smiled with all her teeth. "You should have thought about that before you moved in," she said. Then Daniel said quietly, "We can't have bright porch lights here. It upsets the old houses." They closed the door. I came back home and sat on my couch and felt the floor give way a little, like the ground under me was made of wet paper. I had not come this far to be mocked and made sick in my own home. I had not worked 2 jobs, sold off my grandmother's furniture, taken out loans, and moved across state lines to live under a rule I didn't know existed. My neighbors had weaponized sound. They had weaponized a lie about a baby. And as the sirens swelled down the street and the baby cries layered over them and my phone buzzed with another bill notice, something inside me snapped like an old branch. I am not a violent person. I don't want anyone hurt. But I also will not be erased by people who think their traditions give them the right to ruin lives. For 3 months I tried to outlast them. For 3 months I failed. Tonight, in that hush between wails, I made a decision I could not unmake. I would make them feel what I felt. I would make them understand in the only language they'd listen to. I pulled my laptop onto my knees and started to type, not a call to the cops, not a polite email, but a list. Names, times, the kinds of noises. The little cracks in the fence. How many hours of sleep they got. How much sleep I'd lost. It was intrusive and petty, and it felt like breath. And then I added one thing to the top of the list, something I had sworn I wouldn't do, something that tasted like ash on my tongue when I typed it. If they won't sleep, then neither will they. I wasn't always fragile. 2 years ago, I was the kind of person who could bounce back from anything because I believed I had nothing left to lose. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens with a mother who worked nights and a father who left when I was 10. My childhood learned mechanics were thrift store furniture, never enough money, and an instinct to hustle so the bills didn't swallow us. I learned to sleep quickly, on couches, in cars, on airport floors, because sleep wasn't a right. It was a trade-off you made to survive. I moved to Portland because of a promise I made to myself after my last relationship blew up and took half my confidence with it. I sold the engagement ring, cashed in the little 401k I'd been ignoring, and used the down payment to buy a small Craftsman with a porch that sagged in the middle and a backyard that could fit a single crooked garden. It was ugly in a way that felt honest. It felt like mine. I told myself if I could make this house into a refuge, maybe I could make myself into someone steady again. Work used to be the distraction. I run a small web design shop, nights and weekends, client calls and caffeine. It was enough to keep me paying the mortgage and occasionally eating sushi. Then the layoffs hit my largest client, then a clerk at the bank misfiled something, and suddenly I was juggling invoices while trying to learn how to fix a leaking sink. I started sleeping in 19-minute increments and sending emails at 2 a.m. I did that thing people romanticize about sacrifice until you build something, and then the thing you built demanded more sacrifice. My mother called every Sunday like clockwork. She would ask about my job, my neighbors, whether I'd eaten, and I lied and told her everything was fine. I didn't tell her about the nights I sat in the ER parking lot and listened to a man in a hoodie beg the attendant for cash. I didn't tell her about the way my hands trembled when I tried to cut an avocado. The truth felt like it would break her, and I had already broken a lot of things. Before the couple moved in, the street had been quiet in that watchful, neighborly way where people leave newspapers on porches and don't ask too many questions. There were rituals. An old man who watered his roses at dawn, teenagers skateboarding on weekends, a block party where everyone brought potato salad. The first 2 weeks were pure relief. I painted the guest room, started a small herb bed, and for the first time in years I ate dinner at a table that wasn't a laptop stand. When Mara smiled like everything was a joke at my first awkward grill-out, I wanted to believe her. Daniel brought over a pie and said something about being excited to be part of the community. They talked about neighborhood associations and Block Watch like it was a club you had to be invited into. At the time, their friendliness was a balm, a promise that maybe this place was where I could finally stop defending myself. There are little things about people that stick to you. Mara's laugh, the one that turned up at the moment my spine felt raw, sounded like someone who had practiced cruelty and wrapped it in charm. Daniel had a neatness to him, the kind of man who alphabetized spices and kept receipts for things no one would ever ask about. Bruno, their dog, was trained so well it felt performative. He never jumped on guests, never barked except at exactly 2 in the afternoon when mail arrived. Those details settled in the back of my head like small stones. I had a bad reaction to cruelty before. Once I let someone gaslight me into thinking I was the problem for wanting boundaries. It took me years to recover from that. This time, when the noises started, something older than my patience surfaced. Not anger, not yet. It was the brittle, animal part of me that remembers being small and defenseless and swore it would never be small again. When the third ambulance bill came and Mara waved at my porch in the morning like she was offering me a good luck charm, I felt all the old survival strategies snap into focus. I would not let this become another story where I am the one who shrinks. I would not leave. I could not afford to. And I had to find a way to fight something that wasn't visible to the police and wasn't illegal on paper. So I started paying attention. I watched the patterns the way you study a wounded animal before you make a move. I learned their routines, their small cruelties, and the one oddity that made something in me tilt. Daniel never locked the basement door, not ever. I watched it sit half ajar like an invitation. I don't know how much of me was fear and how much was a sharpened survival instinct. All I knew was I had to do something, and whatever I did next would be the thing that meant I could stay. The list I typed that night wasn't just breath, it was a plan forming around a hurt so real it had a taste. The next few weeks blurred together like an overexposed photo, flashes of noise, silence, anger, and exhaustion. Every night had a pattern now. Between midnight and 4, the speakers played in rotating loops. Baby cries, sirens, dogs barking, sometimes distorted whispers that sounded almost human but not quite. I started recording them on my phone, cataloging timestamps like evidence. The police told me there was no proof. The sounds were coming from a single property. Daniel and Mara denied everything, smiling too wide, voices smooth as glass. I tried to act normal during the day. I took freelance calls, forced myself to shower, pretended to sleep when my mom called. But my body was unraveling. My hands twitched from too much caffeine and too little rest. I jumped every time a car backfired. I kept thinking I saw someone standing behind my curtains. Once, at 2:47 a.m., I swear I saw a faint red glow flicker from the bushes between our houses, like a recording light. I started spending hours online, searching noise laws, trespassing clauses, anything that could justify fighting back. But every path ended in the same wall, too little evidence, too expensive to pursue. And every time I stepped outside, Mara found a way to taunt me. Once, while I was watering my wilted basil plants, she leaned over the fence with a cup of coffee and said, "Rough night. You should really invest in better insulation." Then she winked. That wink made my skin crawl. The thing about sleep deprivation is that it changes your mind first, then your morals. After week 10, I was hallucinating whispers in my own house, hearing phantom cries when the speakers were silent. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart galloping, convinced there was someone in the hall. I started leaving lights on in every room. I couldn't stand the dark anymore. One morning, I found a note on my porch, written in looping cursive on expensive stationery. "The light disturbs the balance. Please stop before something worse happens." No signature. That's when the dread curdled into fury. I drove around the block twice that day, trying to see where the sound might be hidden. And that's when I noticed it. A strange, small box wedged beneath their fence near my driveway. It was matte black, wired to a tiny battery pack, with a motion sensor aimed directly toward my front steps. When I crouched to get a closer look, Bruno started barking like he'd been trained to raise hell. Within seconds, Mara opened the door, voice sugar-sweet. "Need help with something?" I froze, smiled back like nothing was wrong, and went inside. My hands were shaking, but something in me shifted. I knew then that this wasn't random harassment. It was deliberate, controlled, and almost ritualistic in how they did it. I tore through online forums that night, looking for anything similar. Hidden speaker harassment, subsonic frequency attacks, psychological warfare. None of it made sense, and yet all of it did. The next day, I noticed Daniel out front, adjusting something under the gutter. From my window, I saw the faint glint of metal, another speaker, smaller, angled downward. He caught me looking and smiled, a calm, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass. I pressed my phone camera against the window and zoomed in. He mouthed it again, slow and deliberate. "Turn off the light." That night, I unplugged every light in the house, not because I was scared, but because I wanted them to think I was. I sat in the dark, staring through the window, watching their porch glow faintly blue from a bug zapper. For the first time in weeks, silence held. But then, around 3:30 a.m., I heard something new, a faint recording of my own voice. My voice, the sound of me crying during one of my late-night meltdowns, captured somehow, looped back through a hidden speaker. That was when I stopped being afraid. That was when I decided this wasn't going to end with another complaint or police visit. It was going to end with them learning what it means to lose peace completely. And if my plan worked, they wouldn't just hear noises anymore. They'd start to see things too. The first real crack in their perfect act came one night in late August. The air was thick with wildfire smoke, and everyone's windows stayed shut to keep out the haze. That was the night I realized Mara and Daniel had slipped. They weren't as careful as they thought. It started when I heard a faint hum coming from my backyard shed. a noise I hadn't noticed before because it was drowned out by all their chaos. When I opened the door, I found a cluster of tiny wires snaking through a hole in the wall, running from my yard toward theirs. Someone had drilled through the shared fence, fed the wires through, and patched it with a bit of paint the same shade as my siding. They'd planted speakers on my property. I sat there on the shed floor, breathing smoke and disbelief. Every ounce of fear I'd had curdled into something colder. I followed the wires as far as I could without crossing the line, and the path led directly toward their basement wall, the one Daniel never locked. That night, I knocked again. No smile this time, no pretending. Mara opened the door halfway, eyes sharp, phone already in hand like she'd been expecting me. I didn't even get to speak before she said, "If you come onto our property again, we'll call the police." I told her about the wires, about the hole in my shed, about the sound of my own voice being played back to me. Her face changed, not guilt, not surprise, something else, something close to amusement but darker. "Oh, you finally noticed," she said softly. "Took you long enough." My mouth went dry. "Why are you doing this?" Her smile widened. "Because people like you ruin neighborhoods like this. You move in, you change things, you make it bright and loud and cheap. We keep it quiet here. We keep it clean." She leaned forward then, lowering her voice. "You think you bought a house, but you bought a mistake." Daniel appeared behind her. He didn't speak, just stared at me with that cold, managerial blankness, the kind you see in HR meetings before someone gets fired. Then he said, "You should leave before this turns ugly." I wanted to scream, but I realized they wanted that. They fed off it. So I just said, "You made a mistake putting those on my property. You've already lost." And I walked away before my hands could shake. The next morning, the wires were gone, fence patched, shed door hanging open like nothing had ever happened. I called the police again. This time, the responding officer walked the perimeter with me, shining a flashlight at the patched wood. "Could have been kids," he said, bored. "You sure it's not just stress? I mean, you've been making a lot of reports." That's when I realized Daniel must have spoken to them first, maybe even had a friend on the force. The smirk on the cop's face told me everything. He thought I was losing it. When I came back inside, there was an envelope under my door. No name, just a single printed message. "We warned you. Leave before winter." Inside was a photograph me, sitting at my kitchen table, head in my hands, taken through the window. My stomach flipped. My mind went white. They'd been inside my backyard. They'd been watching me. I called a friend, the only one I trusted enough to tell, and asked her to come stay a night, just to see if I was imagining it. She lasted 3 hours before she heard the first loop of baby cries and the whispering voices. At 2 a.m., she ran into my room, pale and trembling. "That's not normal," she said. "That's recorded, that's—" A loud bang interrupted her. Something hit the side of the house hard enough to rattle the glass. I grabbed my phone, shaking so bad I could barely hold it, and turned on the porch light. There on the lawn was Daniel barefoot, expressionless, holding a speaker in one hand. When he saw me see him, he just placed it down on the grass, slow and deliberate, and said, "You brought this on yourself." Then he walked back inside. That was the moment it all shifted for me. They weren't just cruel, they were organized, calculated, dangerous. And whatever balance they kept talking about, it wasn't just a metaphor. Something told me they were following a rule, a ritual older than this neighborhood itself. And I was the next offering. After that night, I stopped sleeping entirely. The constant fear had burned away my exhaustion and left something clear, electric, and dangerous in its place. I wasn't scared anymore. I was done. I spent 3 straight days doing nothing but planning. Not reacting. Planning. First, I bought a pair of wireless cameras, the discreet kind meant for birdwatching. I hid them under the eaves, inside a flower pot, and behind the gutter facing their yard. The feed went straight to a private cloud drive. I set the cameras to record motion only between midnight and 5 a.m. That window would tell me everything. Second, I installed a small decibel meter app on an old phone and left it recording overnight. If they turned those sounds on again, I'd have proof of volume, duration, and timing. Evidence that would stand up in small claims court or city mediation. Not that I expected either to help me, but I needed data. Third, I made friends with someone who could actually help me. A city electrician named Pete, who sometimes worked freelance for the neighborhood. He was the kind of guy who understood wires better than words. I asked him to check for faulty grounding on my property. He didn't need to know the full truth, just enough to notice that something might have been installed illegally near my fence line. When Pete came by 2 days later, he whistled low. "You've got some hidden wiring running parallel to your main line," he said. "Looks recent. Someone spliced in off your exterior outlet. That's theft, technically. Someone's using your power." I stared at him. "Can you trace where it goes?" He followed the wires to the edge of the property, right to that half-open basement door. "Straight into their wall," he said. My stomach twisted. They weren't just harassing me. They were feeding off my house. Pete offered to cut the power to the line. I told him not yet. I needed to know what happened when I did. I paid him extra to keep quiet and left the wire untouched. That night, I sat on the floor of my living room watching the camera feeds on my laptop. Around 2:13 a.m., motion alert pinged. On screen, Daniel stepping out of his basement, wearing headphones, carrying a small black box, one of the same kind I'd seen before, and walking toward the shared fence. He bent down, adjusted something, and walked back inside. When I zoomed in, I saw a faint red light glowing from the box. Not a speaker, a sensor. They weren't just playing sounds randomly, they were triggering them based on my movements. Every time I turned on my porch light, they knew I was awake. Every time I stepped outside, they knew exactly when to start the noises. They had turned my home into a living laboratory of psychological torture. I wanted to scream. Instead, I started writing. Every detail, every timestamp, every dollar I'd lost. I compiled it into a file, not for the police, not for revenge yet, but for leverage. Then I did something stupid, or maybe smart. Depends how you look at it. I left a note under their door. It said, "If you think you're the only ones who can play with sound, you're wrong." I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't because of fear. It was because I was calculating something that scared even me, a plan that would turn their own tactics against them. If they wanted to use sound to ruin me, I'd use silence to destroy them. But first, I needed one last piece of proof, something that would break the illusion of control they had built. 2 nights later, my cameras caught something I hadn't seen before. Mara alone in the backyard, barefoot, kneeling beside the fence, whispering into one of the hidden boxes. At first I thought she was talking to herself. Then I turned up the audio gain. She wasn't whispering to herself. She was answering. There was another voice. A low, distorted male voice coming from the device. And when I slowed it down later, when I filtered the noise and listened closely, that second voice said something that froze me completely. "The offering resists. Continue until she leaves or breaks." That was the night I knew this wasn't just harassment. There was something else happening in that house, something that had rules and purpose, and a plan that I'd just stepped into. And I decided then, shaking but resolute, that I'd dismantle it piece by piece, whatever it was. Because if this was a game, I was going to win. I can't write the rest in the same confessional way you've been reading. What happened next crosses from a neighborhood dispute into things that belong in a police file. What you need to understand is that I did 3 things. I took every recording and wire sample to the police and to the city inspector Pete knew. I got a restraining order. I moved out. Everything else that happened, the nights they kept the noise going even after the citations, the way the city finally sent code enforcement officers, the day the utility company disconnected their power when they found the illegal splicing, those are facts on paper now. They weren't stories anymore, they were evidence. Once the case opened, I started sleeping again for the first time in months. The silence was so strange it hurt my ears. If you're waiting for the twist, it wasn't supernatural and it wasn't a secret cult. When the investigators went through their basement, they found rows of old audio equipment and a computer running loops of pre-recorded sound effects. Daniel had worked in sound design years ago. They were manipulating the entire block, trying to force the few remaining owners to sell their homes cheap so that they and a local property investor could buy them. My house was the test case. The words I'd heard Mara whispering weren't to some other voice. They were voice-activated commands for the system. The box repeated whatever phrase triggered the next file. They'd built it to sound eerie on purpose. That's what the police told me later. That's what the report said. The offering was just greed. There's a line between revenge and justice. I didn't get to cross it the way I wanted. The courts took care of them instead. But in the end, they lost their licenses, their house, and whatever power they thought they had. I tell this part quickly because it doesn't feel like mine anymore. The twist is that monsters are almost never supernatural. They're ordinary people with expensive hobbies and no conscience. When the police finished collecting evidence, the house next door went dark for the first time in months. The silence felt thick, like the whole street was holding its breath. I thought that would be the end, that once they were charged, the noise, the fear, the headaches would just stop. But trauma doesn't quit because paperwork says it should. I spent nights sitting in my half-empty living room, staring at the fence that had divided my life into before and after. I kept replaying every conversation, trying to figure out why they did it. It couldn't just be greed. No one spends months terrorizing someone for a property deal. Not like that. I got my answer the day the detective called. He said they'd found more in the basement, not just the wires and recordings, but folders. Hundreds of digital files labeled with street names. Audio tracks of crying babies, barking dogs, police sirens, static, all prearranged into patterns. Each file named after an address. Mine included, so were 5 other houses on the block. They hadn't started with me. They'd done this before. When questioned, Daniel didn't deny it. He told police he was conditioning the neighborhood. Said he believed sound could influence behavior, make people anxious, irrational, desperate to leave. He called it environmental persuasion. He'd been testing it for years with the investor, who paid him bonuses for every property that went up for sale below market value. But it wasn't just about money. According to Mara's interview transcript, she called it cleansing. She said she didn't like the way new people changed the rhythm, claimed the noises restored balance. That line about the neighborhood eating newbies for breakfast, it wasn't a joke, it was her justification. They actually thought they were protecting their community by breaking people down until they ran. Hearing that chilled me more than all the nights of noise ever did. The cruelty wasn't random, it was intentional. Precise. Every time I'd turned on my porch light, every sound they played, every smile she gave when I looked exhausted, it was all part of their experiment. I wasn't a neighbor to them, I was data. They'd even recorded notes on my behavior, subject showing irritability, heart rate stress visible, isolation complete. That last one nearly made me vomit. All that time, I'd been thinking I was losing my mind. But they'd been tracking my breakdown like a project milestone. The detective said it would take months to process everything. They had federal charges coming for wiretapping, harassment, and property damage. But I barely heard him. I just sat there staring at the wall, realizing the truth. They never wanted to chase me out for money or noise or rules. They wanted to prove they could control someone completely. They wanted to own fear. That was the real reason, the thing behind the polished smiles and fake hospitality. They wanted power, and my suffering was just their proof that it worked. The realization hit so deep I couldn't cry. I just sat there, numb, breathing in the silence I'd fought for. But silence isn't peace when it's filled with memories. I didn't want revenge out of rage anymore. I wanted it out of justice. Out of a need to end their control for good. So while they were in custody, I started preparing one final step, not for them to hear, but for everyone else to know. Because if they used sound to control, I'd use their own recordings to expose them. And when I was done, the entire city would hear exactly what they'd done. The detectives gave me back copies of the audio files for the civil suit. I sat on my living room floor with a laptop, a pair of noise-canceling headphones, and 3 weeks of free time while their case crawled through court. Each track had a timestamp and a note. I spliced together the worst of them, my own voice crying, the sirens, the fake baby wails, and matched them to the camera footage that proved where the sounds came from. When I was finished, it wasn't evidence anymore. It was a timeline of cruelty that anyone could understand in 5 minutes. I sent that file to the local paper with the subject line, "How to Ruin a Neighborhood." They ran it online the next morning. Within hours, the video was everywhere. Reporters called it the Noise House case. The comments were brutal. People I'd never met flooded the city hotline with complaints. Former tenants of other homes stepped forward saying they'd heard the same things and had moved away thinking they were going insane. By the time Mara and Daniel posted bail, their faces were plastered across every local station. Their employer fired them. The investor they worked with was subpoenaed. Their house was tagged for inspection, condemned within a week, and put up for auction to pay restitution. I didn't buy it. I didn't need to. Just knowing that no one would ever live there under their name again was enough. When the trial ended, the judge ordered them to pay damages for harassment, medical costs, and property violations. I used the settlement to replace the porch light they'd hated so much with a brighter one. LED, motion sensing, impossible to ignore. Sometimes I still wake up expecting the noise, heart pounding, waiting for the first fake cry to start. But it doesn't. There's just quiet and the faint buzz of that light outside my window. It's not fear anymore, it's proof. I learned that revenge doesn't always look like fire or shouting. Sometimes it's a headline. Sometimes it's the sound of your own breathing in a house that finally belongs to you. The night after the verdict, I stood on my porch, flipped on that light, and whispered into the dark fence line. This neighborhood eats monsters for breakfast. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled.